My name is Johanna Wagstaffe. I'm a meteorologist and an earth scientist. Every day, I see the effects of climate change through my work, a relentless cycle of extreme weather, terrifying storms, deadly heat domes, wildfires, droughts. But I remain in awe of the natural world and how it finds ways to adapt. And that's what we explore on Planet Wonder. We're live. I'm here at BC Wildlife Park with breaking news. Climate change is affecting all animals, but in different ways. I'm here with Pippin the goat to get some perspective. Pippin, how do you plan on regulating your body temperature during the next heat dome? What are your plans for a warmer world? Have you done any preparations? I'm working on getting answers, but I'm going to stay on this developing story. Back to you in studio.
Clear.
What we do know is that mammals have a hard time regulating their body temperature in excessive heat. We also know reptiles exist in extreme climates, so that got me wondering. Do we need to be cold-blooded for a warmer world? As kids, most of us learned that the animal kingdom can be divided into two groups, cold-blooded and warm-blooded. But those terms are inaccurate, implying that animals are in a never-ending struggle to stay warm or cold. Get ready for Ectotherm versus Endotherm 101 with Wagstaffe. Ectothermic animals, like reptiles and amphibians, rely on the external environment to regulate their body temperatures. If it's too hot, these animals seek cooler places, and if it's too cold, they may find a sunny spot to warm up. They can also slow down their metabolisms, reducing their need to seek food until environmental conditions improve. Endotherms, like mammals, birds, and us humans, regulate body temperatures by producing heat within the body. But that takes a lot of energy, aka food. And that means they have to slog through rougher conditions, like extreme heat, because they can't power down the furnace or AC unit. Before we find out if we'll be living under reptile overlords someday, know that the animal kingdom has already taken a big hit from climate change. When facing a warmer world, animals basically respond in one of three ways. Some adapt their behaviors, others undergo rapid evolution and pass down beneficial traits, and still others straight up die out. To learn more about how climate change is impacting animals, we met up with research biologist Karl Larsen. And what better location than the BC Wildlife Park in Kamloops, a rehabilitation center for orphaned and injured animals. Okay, Karl and friends, how is climate change affecting animals?
There's a myriad number of ways that it could happen, and I think that's what people are really trying to work on right now is understanding the different mechanisms by which climate change can affect animals. And we know it's going to have an effect. With some animals, it's very obvious. The habitat's going to change. Some animals are going to be trapped in some ways.
And what are all the different sort of general tools that animals might have to change up with climate change? You know, I think of hibernation right away.
Right. A big concept is migration, and people think of migration as, well, the birds fly back for the summer. But migration in a climate change context, really you're thinking about how is the species going to move across the landscape, particularly as habitat changes.
So we're still trying to figure a lot of this out.
I think so. I mean, it's very obvious for some species, like say high latitude species that are going to have their range of habitats expand. We may see increases in their range, but then also some animals, say, that are high elevation on mountains, like hoary marmots that depend on alpine habitat. Well, that may disappear completely, and so will the animals, at least in those areas.
Let's go down the rabbit hole. Adam, this is a live stream into the marmots that are hibernating right now in this building. Who are we looking at?
So we're just looking at 3 of the marmots that are here, and this is Philip, Rowley, and Violet. We're kind of hoping that Philip and Violet will reproduce in the spring.
Young love that we are witnessing at this moment. So they are in hibernation. Have you seen any trends in the past 20 years when it comes to climate change and changes to their hibernation?
There's a lot of concern about how those lower snowpack might impact their hibernation. So they're really reliant on snow to provide a layer of insulation, kind of like a blanket, over their hibernacula, these underground chambers that they're actually digging and then hibernating in over the winter. Those chambers should be a really constant, steady temperature, but without the snow to insulate it, there's concern that those temperatures will vary. They might get colder, and that would really impact the marmot's ability to stay warm. They'd have to use up a lot more body energy, produce a lot more body heat, and that could impact their survival. Marmots live, Vancouver Island marmots live in these subalpine bowls that are essentially kept tree-free by snow action. So avalanches and snow creep scrape any vegetation that's on the hill, kind of off the hill, and that's especially true for bigger trees. But as the snow energy is reduced, its ability to have that clearing effect is reduced too. And we've been seeing, and we've been seeing this for decades now, more and more trees invading these subalpine meadows, slowly converting these meadows from avalanche chutes and bowls into forest. And unfortunately for marmots, they're not a forest-dwelling species. They really need that open space to detect predators, find food, dig hibernation chambers. And so that's a huge concern for them, is losing this habitat. And that's something, unfortunately, that's been happening for, again, at least 20 years now. And is posed to increase in speed in the future.
Karl, I wanted to ask you and Karina, the rubber boa, what kind of animal behaviors enhance the ability to survive? What qualities does Karina have that would give her the ability to survive during the heat dome?
Like all reptiles and amphibians, she's an ectotherm. What that means is it gives them several big advantages. One is that they can tolerate a really wide range of temperatures. So for you or me, if our body temperature goes up 1 or 2 degrees or down 1 or 2 degrees, we're in trouble, right? It's fever, hypothermia. They have a body that's built for handling a range of temperatures. The other advantage is they don't have to eat as often or drink water because they're not fueling this big engine inside them that's geared to keeping their body temperature at this narrow range. What we found during the big heat dome a couple of years ago is most of our snakes that we were following through radio telemetry just went down in a hole and stayed there throughout the whole heat dome. And it probably wasn't the best situation, and they definitely lost weight in that, but they could do that.
You're good?
Rolling.
Rolling.
Meet Veronica McKelvey, Karl Larsen's master's student. She tracks snake behavior.
Veronica, tell me about your rattlesnake research.
Yeah, so I study the overwintering behavior, not just of rattlesnakes actually, also of Great Basin gopher snakes and western yellow-bellied racers. So I got a little trilogy here, 3 of them, all the snakes. I'm like, give me all of them, yeah. So I look at their overwintering behavior, and what's really interesting about here in Canada is that we have winter. It's a big sort of roadblock for snakes. They have to be able to survive in some way, and they use these really cool features that we have in the landscape called dens. So when I track the snake, I use a receiver and antenna. I turn it on and I put it to the unique frequency of the radio transmitter. When I turn it on, should beep. And I basically hot and cold find it, you know what I mean? Like, oh, it's louder this way. Sometimes it takes a long time, but it should get me to the exact location of the snake. So for the dens, they're gonna be inside, especially in the wintertime. But what's really cool is that these dens provide structural, thermal, and humidity conditions for the snakes to survive over winter. So we learned earlier they're ectotherms, right? So in order to survive, they have to have that nice air temperature that is in their range of survival. If they're out here in the winter, it's probably like, once we hit those -20s, I'm sorry, the snake is done for, yeah, exactly. So they have these nice dens tucked away. And what I'm really interested in is this communal feature that some snakes exhibit. So they'll come to these dens, but congregate. And it's really interesting because we usually associate snakes as being solitary, kind of alone. And so there's a few different theories about why communal denning occurs. And the one I'm most interested in is this idea that there's not enough dens, and especially here in these northern latitudes where we see communal denning increasingly.
So interesting. And with climate change and the sort of rise in elevation, this really ties in.
Right, yeah. Well, we could expect changes as a result to this because we see snakes more down south not communally denning. And so this behavior is really unique up in higher latitudes. So it could be shifting as a result of climate change as well.
And what do you call that ability to adapt within a wider range?
So we refer to behaviors or any adaptation as either being canalized or plastic. And they're relative terms, but canalized means it's really honed in and selection has fine-tuned it. Do you want to hold her?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me about your plastic qualities.
Yeah, and so a plastic trait is one that's very malleable and the animal can use it in a lot of different circumstances. And think about coyotes living in...
Fine.
Yeah, thinking about coyotes living in, the deserts of Mexico or downtown Vancouver, they've got very plastic traits that allow them to live in a lot of different conditions. But then we may have specialists that are very hard tuned to certain conditions, and if those shift or change, that'll be problems. And like a good example I always think about is some little salamander that needs to live in a damp, cool forest.
Or maybe salmon?
Yeah, salmon, I mean, and that's a really good example because we know salmon get stressed now if they're going up streams and there's, extreme temperature differences, or if the water's warmer than not, that can cause problems.
So having plastic qualities like Karina's ability to just go underground during a heat dome in the middle of the summer is advantageous in climate change.
The big unknown is what's going to happen to their prey. And that's another level that we still need to try and understand.
Salmon and salamanders aren't the only species that need specific conditions to thrive. Honeybees are also in trouble, and that includes the ones in our cities. That was some good honey. Honey that was made by these very bees on the roof of CBC Vancouver. Bet you didn't know we had beehives on top of our headquarters. Now, these bees right in here are inactive because it's wintertime. I'm not even gonna open the lid because they literally could die. They're maintained by the Vancouver Honeybees Community Beekeepers, whose whole mission is environmentally friendly and sustainable beehives in urban areas. Now, those beekeepers say that these bees are doing great, but bees are susceptible to climate change. First of all, droughts and extreme heat can dry out the very flowers that bees pollinate and go to, and extreme rain events makes it hard for bees to fly to the flower diversity that they need. And also, the season is extending, which means the window for viruses and mites to get into the colonies is also extending. And new studies say that the pollen actually changes flavor with a larger season. All that being said, humans can help. We can plant more diverse gardens and let our flowers reseed themselves. Thanks, bees. Whoa. Okay, so Karl, I want to talk about evolution now. And when I think about evolution, I think about, beak size. And I wish I could say this was my burrowing owl Nenum that I carry around on my hand all the time. But let's talk about evolution.
Evolution and natural selection have never been more important in our understanding of how animals respond to the environment than it is now because of climate change. So much of what's going to unfold in the next century is going to depend a lot on the evolutionary capacity of animals to adapt or respond to these big changes that are happening right now.
I'm going to go ahead and jump on a tangent here. Thanks to Charles Darwin and his finches, we've all heard of natural selection. It's the process that drives evolution and leads to the diversity of life on Earth. So the key is that all individuals, myself included, in any population of any species are different in some ways. And that natural variability means that some individuals have traits better suited to the environment than others. these advantageous traits are passed down, and over time they become more common in the population. Eventually, natural selection can lead to an entirely new species. Okay, so what about these finches? Well, Darwin first proposed his theory of natural selection, this is actual drawing, after a trip to the Galapagos Islands back in 1831. He noticed different characteristics of beaks on what seemed to be the same species of bird living on different islands. It turns out there are many different species of Galapagos finch that descended from one common ancestor. The theory is about 2 million years ago, some of these birds were blown off course to the islands, and over time they evolved in different ways to suit their new environment. With their diversity of beak sizes and shapes, each species has adapted to a specific type of food. The ground finch, for example, you can see has this thick beak to feed on large hard seeds. The warbler finch has more of a long pointy bill to catch insects hiding between leaves, and the woodpecker finch even uses twigs to get at food. So Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, basically the OG manual on evolution. But get this, 150 years later, a zoologist from the University of British Columbia, Dolph Schluter, fleshed out Darwin's theories and has recently been internationally recognized for his work. Call it the evolution of evolution.
If you think of this little guy or any other species that lays eggs, there's probably variation in that trait. But under so-called normal or historical norms, animals who laid eggs early on or laid them very late may have been at a disadvantage. So that kind of kept the mean or median egg-laying date stable. But now, all of a sudden, maybe there's an advantage to laying your eggs early, or maybe you can get away with laying them late, or maybe you can lay them twice in 1 year if it's getting longer and longer.
So if Nenam, naturally lays her eggs a little earlier, and we're seeing the start to spring happen a little earlier, that's a trait that she could pass down that would be advantageous to her young.
Yeah, you could see that trait start to expand, and that mean date of egg laying starts to shift earlier.
Carl, here's an elk tree.
Oh, thanks.
I think Autumn
For me or the elk?
Yeah, are really into this. What tools do we have to predict which species are more at risk with climate change?
People take different approaches to predicting what the impacts might be. One way is habitat modeling. So actually taking what we know about what an animal looks for and uses in its habitat, and then using predictive mapping to say, how is the ecosystem going to change through climate change, and is that going to open up or cause an expansion or a contraction of areas suitable? So that's one powerful way to look at it. The other way is more to focus on the actual behavioral ecology of the animal and ask the questions of, are these species, do they have that range of behavior or plasticity to allow them to extend their range elsewhere? So something like an elk is capable, an individual elk can move a lot further in its lifetime than a rattlesnake. And so they may have the capacity to shift, and we see elk populations where some move and some don't. And so there's that plastic behavior, and maybe the migrants will be favored over time. So it's a really exciting time for animal ecology. It's unfortunate that the circumstances that have created it.
Polar bears have become an accidental icon for our warming world as the ice they rely on to find food melts away. But that hasn't stopped artists from having hope for the strong species that inspires them.
Since I've been an artist, I mostly carve polar bears, and that's something I love doing. It came from my family in this town, King Lake. Today I'm carving a polar bear. This is the beginning of shaping I think polar bears are magnificent animals. They are very adapted to this environment. I grew up around polar bears around here in Baffin Island. So I also grew up where artists making polar bears. I think for the climate change, I guess the weather melts a little faster and takes longer to freeze. I think more over in Alaska. Over here, the elders believe the bears are quite healthy and they're able to hunt seal in this frozen sea ice, and they're able to adapt anything.
Do you need to be cold-blooded, aka ectothermic, like Franklin, to
Right.
survive in a warmer world?
I'm not going to say yes or no to that because it's like everything else. It depends on so many things. But in some cases, being an ectotherm might be an advantage if the climate's going to warm up on you and you're a Canadian snake that has been living for 10,000 years in a short summer and a cool summer, while your cousins in Arizona have been living in a very hot climate. So their capacity, those types of animals may have a better capacity to deal with extreme heat over short periods of time.
So in the end, rather than being endo or ectothermic, it's all about ecosystems reassembling in a warmer world.
Right, and just how, there's this concept we call the niche in animal ecology and plant ecology, where everything lives in its, this little system that works well for it. Those niches are going to shift, and some animals will just simply expand their range where others may not have that capacity.
Did you get a pandemic pet? Shame. Just kidding. I now have fish to go along with my giant Bernese mountain dog, and I'm clearly not leaving here without a rabbit. But if you have a pet or you're considering getting a pet, you might want to consider the carbon footprint of a pet, because companion animals are not only impacted, they also impact the environment. So thinking about the carbon footprint of these little guys is important. The decisions we make for our pets might not be the best for the environment. How much more energy are we spending to heat and cool our homes to keep them comfortable and safe? How much longer are we driving to get them a trail run? How many outfits are we buying for Christmas cards? And how much food are we feeding them? That last one might be a lot. According to a 2017 study, US cats and dogs alone, feeding them is equivalent to 13.6 million cars on the road. But according to a 2021 study from UBC, there are ways to be a sustainable pet owner. The biggest thing is to just include your pets when thinking about your family's carbon footprint and offset. For example, buy sustainable food. This is just lettuce, you're fine. Compost their poo, or think about getting a heat pump for your home. Are you hopeful that our research will be fast enough to sort of help with intervention?
Boy, there's so many people right now, biologists, working on understanding how climate change will impact species. And if it does, what can we do about it? And so I think we're going to have a very good picture, increasingly clear picture on what climate change means to these animals. Now they're dealing with a very quick, relatively quick shift in the environment. So will they be able to respond to that as a species by moving into new areas, or will individuals be able to adapt through the plasticity we talked about?
In the end, it'll come down to an animal's ability to move to what it needs to survive in a warmer world, and not all animals will. Still, we can help. To quote Ted Andrews, the animal kingdom shows us the potential we can unfold, but to learn from them, we have to first learn to speak with them.
Here's some tips to keep your pet cool in a heat wave. Put ice packs under your pet's, the sound. Ice cubes underneath your pets and armpits.
Does that feel good, Rodney?
You get a cold treat like an ice cream with your dog.